Hello everyone, this is something a little bit different. This is Devader. This caught my eye just because of its very strange kind of art style dissonance where like some enemies and some other things kind of look a bit different from everything else, and that sort of mix of styles tends to attract my eyes a little bit. And then I discovered that it was actually a sort of arcade style twin stick shooter in a very old school way though. The best way, and this is not really doing it justice, but the best way I can describe it is imagine if something like Crimson Land or Geometry Wars and something like Robotron had a really weird baby. This is kind of like what that would be like. It is ostensibly an isometric 2D sort of arcadey shooter in like the twin stick style, although I use keyboard and mouse and it works very well for that, but you can use either way. And it takes place on an alien planet where you are a sort of alien, I suppose, devader. You are not invading to take over the planet, you are devading. In other words, you come down to protect this lesser equipped alien race from eradication at the hands of a different sort of overarching enemy. And that is why there are actually two failure states to this game, which is sort of interesting. The first way that you can actually just get a game over is, of course, the very obvious lose all of your lives and continues and have nothing left to go on. But the other way is, if you see that big crystalline sort of geometric structure in the middle of the map there, that is the Nexus, and it sort of represents the last haven, the last bastion, the last hope of this race that you're trying to protect. And in the very top middle of the screen, you will see a sort of overarching health gauge for it and its general status. If that falls to zero, if the entire place collapses, then you lose as well. So you can actually not lose any lives at all, but if you don't do your job as a devader correctly and protect this structure, then you will lose. And I want to say right off the bat that this game is really, really hard. The farthest I've ever made it is like wave 37 or 38, I think it was, and this game has like over 100 waves, so it's not light on content, to say the least. There's plenty to do. And it has a very interesting sort of progression system that is in run. Once you sort of, lose, you go back to the very beginning. But the progression is involving both upgrades and new gear for yourself. It's kind of interesting. So when you complete a level for the first time, which will consist of like 5-ish waves of beasties, you will go back to a sort of hub screen and you will be able to spend 2 upgrade points. This starts after the very first level, so you'll have 2 upgrade points every time to spend. And you'll have a list of 8 upgrades, although this gets expanded to 12 later on that I've seen so far. It may go even farther than that, I'm not sure yet. And these upgrades consist of everything from giving yourself extra lives, to more armor to help die less, to more shields to help die even less than that, to higher firepower and all sorts of other things. And what's interesting about these upgrades is not only do they have, an upgrade, so if you upgrade the firepower, you will hit harder, but they also have a couple of other sort of intrinsic capabilities to them. The very first time after the first level, the first time you ever choose one of these 8 upgrades, you will actually get a passive ability that stays with you for the rest of that run. And it obviously it's determined by which upgrade you choose. So for instance, if you choose the firepower upgrade, you'll both get the increased firepower that the normal upgrade offers, and you'll also get its respective passive, or I suppose active, ability, which is to be able to call down a supply drop once per level, which will reward you with some extra power-ups and things at will, but only once. And each of these 8 initial upgrade paths has its own sort of active ability that it will give you, but only if it's the very first one you choose. So that's pretty cool because that already sets you up to have a bit of a different run every time, with a very different sort of build that's possible between choosing different upgrades each time and between choosing which your first upgrade is each time to determine what ability you get. And then the other form of progression is every level you will have a choice between 2 different things, and it's usually a piece of new gear for yourself. So for instance, when the very first one you get is a nuke. You actually have a nuclear sort of area of effect, kill everything in this general vicinity sort of weapon as like a screen clearing weapon, and you can actually use it pretty often. But there are 2 different types of nukes, and you get to choose either the remote sort of nuclear missile that strikes down wherever your cursor is, or the nuclear pulse that generates from you at its center instead and harms everything directly around you. They each have their own sort of positives and negatives. Like for instance, the missile has a delay where it has to come down from the sky first, so you have to sort of aim and advance with it. And it does mean that you can actually attack things at a distance though, which is nice. And the pulse has sort of the opposite problem where it comes out like immediately and is very effective right around you, but you have to get close to the things that you want to hit with it. So this concept of having 2 choices every time continues throughout the entire thing from what I've been able to actually play so far. So for instance, you get the choice between different sorts of turrets later on, and you'll have a turret that you can, it's a bit lighter and it doesn't do as much damage, but you can place more of them at once, it seems like, and you can also place and retract them remotely. You don't have to actually be in the area that you want to place them. You can just point to where you want them to go and actually place them and call them back and place them again somewhere else. They're a very mobile turret. The other turret type is a much more stationary one that's more powerful, but is, of course, stationary. You have to get right next to where you want to place to actually put it down and to pick it back up. They're not nearly as mobile, but they have a sort of a pulse around them that helps them survive a bit longer, depending on how you place them, which is nice. And this sort of concept just keeps going. You get, for instance, a chest cannon. And the chest cannon has two options. So you'll have a sort of AoE pulse that fires a big orb forward that explodes into other orbs and is more like a sort of a crowd control sort of weapon. And you have the sonic, which is like a sort of forward-facing heavy cannon that does a ton of damage, but has to be aimed quite precisely because it goes in a straight line. I find that one to be my favorite because I find it satisfying to hit like weak points and enemy heads and things like that with it from afar. It's pretty cool. So yeah, what this actually culminates in is by wave 20 and up, basically you'll have sort of a build going for you as you've encountered these various upgrades and the different upgrade paths and the different mutually exclusive choices between different pieces of gear, and all this makes it to where, you know, each playthrough you'll probably have a bit of a different build and you'll be finding yourself playing a different way, and you can extrapolate between things that you really like and risks to take to play differently this time and stuff like that to make yourself just a little bit more varied each time. It's actually kind of cool. I like the way that it works, and of course this only really is effective if the gameplay itself, the base gameplay, is enjoyable, and oh man, it is. Devader is very hectic. It is extremely hectic. It is very much in the sort of bullet hell style of shoot 'em up as far as that goes, because quite quickly you will find yourself with a screen completely covered in enemies, and in the later levels bosses can actually take up like most of the playing field. They're huge, and of course they will have gigantic curtains of bullets going absolutely everywhere by the end of the whole thing. So the game is definitely quite difficult because of all this, and it's difficult in a very enjoyable way, in that sort of old school arcadey way where there's just so much happening and it almost hurts your eyes a little bit just because of the sheer amount of stuff that's going on screen at a given time, in the later levels especially, where it just gets so hectic and so enjoyable, and it kind of gets your blood pumping like really quickly, and just the whole way through you're in like this adrenaline-fueled zen focus to try and avoid everything and destroy everything at the same time. It's really pretty cool, and I really haven't played a game quite exactly like this in quite some time. Like I said, it's very much sort of in the old school, almost 90s arcade way of doing things, but with some newer elements in it, and that's pretty neat. And of course, we've got to talk about the art style, because look at it. It's very, very colorful, just huge explosions, quite literally, of color all over the place, and your actual craft itself looks pretty neat. You're sort of a weird robotic sort of device that can go around and destroy everything, and even the way that the ground and the overall just sort of levels themselves actually stay permanently scarred with the effects of previous battles is pretty cool. You'll have all these enemies that leave different scars and marks in the ground as they fight and as they die, and all of these pools and scars and scorch marks and things will actually stay between levels to help you have a bit of a unique battlefield, you could say, each time, with different memories of different events in past waves sort of sticking throughout the entire run, which is a really neat way to do things, and that just adds to the sort of unique atmosphere that this game has. It has a very unique atmosphere. It's just quite different from many things that I've played before, and I think one of the biggest aspects to this is the fact that the art style seems to be very soft, we'll say, as in like it changes on certain enemies, and I think this is a deliberate choice to make the enemies seem more alien and more sort of unknowable and strange, is to make the art style around them sort of alter between different enemy types and just look kind of different. It's a really neat way to do things. I don't see very many pieces of media actually doing this, and I think every time I've seen it done, it's been really memorable and really cool, so I definitely like to see it happen. But yeah, there are a ton of enemies in this game, just huge numbers of different kinds of enemies, and the art style between them can change quite a bit. You'll have some enemies that are more obvious and basic, like the octopoid robots that crawl around and fire different sorts of projectiles at you and the Nexus, and then it gets really weird with these like black sort of vector-looking sort of spiders with a billion legs that have really weird attack patterns, and then it gets even weirder with enemies that are as abstract as, say, a bunch of handprints that actually crawl around on the ground and provide different sort of paths of these like scorched handprints after you destroy them that actually stay throughout the entire run. So yeah, the overall enemy style is really interesting, and this makes a lot of the combat really satisfying because you never really know what each thing can actually do until you encounter it, and some of them are just sort of one-off small encounters that you will only see on very certain waves, and some of them are enemies that are mixed into multiple waves and you'll have to learn to deal with in different ways, and this makes for a very, well, a varied gameplay experience that definitely has variety as one of its main goals, I would say, for sure. The variety in this game is quite a focus. And then we get to some of the rarer enemy types, like I mentioned, that only appear in certain waves, and some of these are just really abstract, like these weird octahedron things that are like sort of prisms that float around and multiply randomly and have kind of difficult to comprehend attacks, which I can only assume is exactly the point. Two things that are actually references to other indie games, like for instance, you can actually find a mining drone straight out of Nimbatus, and the wave itself is called Nimbatus, and it's sort of like a mini-boss that goes around and uses its mining lasers and can be disassembled and destroyed in exactly the same way as a drone from that game does actually work, which is a nice touch. And then there are the actual bosses themselves, which are definitely something to be considered, because the boss fights in this game are really a high point. They are, I mean, the combat itself is fun anyway, with all the variety that you actually get access to, but the boss fights are something pretty special, because they can be anything from what's basically an entire huge encircling wave of fidget spinners that fire these weird round projectiles that sort of float around the place, to enormous serpents that take up like half the screen, to these big sort of hollow circles like the Dark Sign that have a bunch of spider legs that fire huge solar beams and stuff, to all sorts of other things, and they each have very different mechanics, to the point where each time you actually face a boss you never fought before, like the entire first half of the boss fight is just trying to figure out what they're actually doing, what their various locomotion methods are, and what their forms of attack actually are, and how you're supposed to counteract these things, which makes for new boss fights to be very entertaining, and boss fights you fought before to be particularly enjoyable, because you have learned, and you can actually put some of that into practice in this next try at them. It's a very interesting game. It is a very rare, in my opinion at least, application of the idea that someone knows very well what actually made a lot of the sort of beloved, oft-thought-of older arcade shooters enjoyable, and was actually able to meld these things successfully with newer school things that didn't overwrite them or make them obsolete or less enjoyable. It's actually kind of a difficult thing to do, and this game manages it very well. It has the old school 2D action that you would probably expect if you've played a lot of games like this, and the really weird bosses and the very strange bullet hell patterns and all sorts of things that people may have actually grown up with or enjoyed, and combines it with things like, upgrades, progression that is based around like multiple levels and upgrade points and things like that, skill trees, the sort of thing that is a bit newer school, but does it in a way that actually makes them complement each other and is enjoyable to play, which is very important. The game is $15, which in my opinion is nothing because of how much stuff there is in it. The fact that each run plays quite a bit differently because of all the various upgrades and the different active and passive abilities you get, and the choices between the different gear that you get, and the fact that it doesn't work the same every time. So Wave 11 during one playthrough is going to be different from Wave 11 of the other playthrough, because there are a lot of different waves that it can cycle between, and not every time you face a certain numerical wave will it pull from the same one. And the same with the bosses. The boss of the second level isn't always exactly the same. There are multiple different bosses that can be on that wave, and you'll have to sort of learn them all. So it is definitely a very interesting experience. It has a lot going for it in terms of its art style, its overall combat, the huge amount of variety that it has in pretty much every aspect, and that makes it just super enjoyable for the type of game that it is if you're looking for something like this. If you liked or enjoyed or had interest in games like Crimson Land or Nation Red, yes, those are named similarly on purpose, games like Geometry Wars even, and other like sort of classic twin-stick shooters, mixed with other things from an old-school perspective like Robotron and stuff like that, this is going to be for you to try out. It is definitely worth a shot, because it just has so much interesting gameplay to it in terms of all the weird enemies and weird bullet patterns and things, that it keeps me going, and I think a lot of other people will find that sort of thing to be pretty enthralling as well. I mean, that's one of my favorite aspects of like bullet hell shooters like Toho, for instance. I like to have just these weird, sometimes abstract, maybe meaningful, maybe not bullet patterns that are fun to learn, and this game is full of that kind of thing, for sure. That sort of weirdness always keeps me interested in this game is that sort of weirdness to the core, and I very much appreciate it. So yeah, this is Devader, available right now on Steam. It is a full release game. It's not an early access or anything. It is available for $15, and there's also a demo for you to try. If you are not sure about the game, if you're not sure if you like it, or if you're not sure how it's going to play on your system because it looks like it's a bit resource intensive, then you can give that demo a shot and try it for yourself, and I would highly recommend that you do so. I will, of course, link everything in the description below this video, as usual, so that you can go and find it yourself. And, yeah, that's Devader. I think that it is absolutely worth a shot, and it only has, right now, just a very small handful of reviews on Steam, which is a crying shame, because this is a sort of game that doesn't come around very often. It is a sort of game that is very rarely pulled off this well, and it's the sort of game that I think we need more of. Not necessarily twin-stick shooters in general, but just very odd games that sort of harken back to the arcade days and other things like that, without being like a nostalgia goggled, you know, where like some things like the difficulty aspects and other things like that are as they used to be without understanding what may or may not make as it used to be good or not. This doesn't really have that problem, although, like I said, it is very hard, but it is hard in a way that feels fair so far. And I should also mention that this is only on one difficulty. The game has 4 difficulties. This is on normal. There's easy and normal, a hard mode, as well as a mode called Deity, which I don't even dare try right now because I'm sure it's next to impossible. But some of the aspects of the difficulty changing are very interesting. Instead of just being like, you know, enemies have more health, they add more bullet patterns. The bosses can get larger and more segmented and have other attacks and stuff to use. So it is a more fun version of higher difficulty, in my opinion, that more games need to be doing. And there's also co-op, I should mention. It is local co-op only for now, which is fair because a lot of indie games can have a problem having enough money to actually, you know, have an online co-op or online multiplayer system that can be quite expensive. So something like this having only local co-op makes sense, and the local co-op is actually very hectic because you can actually have up to 5 people. You can have one person, it supports one person on keyboard and mouse, and 4 people simultaneously on controllers. So yeah, you can do a lot in this game, and I definitely I have to recommend it wholeheartedly because it is that style of 90s arcadey goodness mixed with new school sort of twin-stick shootery goodness that isn't always pulled off to this depth. And I really appreciate the abstract nature of the enemies and the focus on the variety and everything that this game has. I mean, like this right here, for instance, look at all this nonsense. It's really weird. It's like this amorphous collection of blobs that fire out these other blobs that sort of start and stop in random directions to make a sort of maze field that you have to go through while you're destroying them. It's pretty inventive. That's a really neat way to do things. And yeah, the deity mode definitely scares me. There's a lot to unpack when it comes to the harder difficulties of this game because of how ridiculous it gets. But it's also, it's that kind of difficulty that's satisfying to learn because there's so much player choice involved where you can alter your loadouts and your upgrades and everything each time that makes you want to keep trying to encounter the same bosses as before, but with a different sort of loadout and a different sort of playstyle to make it maybe go a little bit differently and see what you can do there. It's that kind of sort of just one more run sort of feeling that games like this always, in my opinion, need. And Devader most certainly pulls that one more run feeling off very well and very colorfully. So yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. If you liked this video, feel free to hit the like button. If you didn't like this video, feel free to hit the dislike button and tell me why. And this has been Devader. Thank you guys ever so much again for watching, and I'll see you next time.